We hurriedly prepared for our first US tour. The first gig was scheduled for October 26, 1967 in San Francisco at Bill Graham's Fillmore, but the journey did not go smoothly. Andrew King says that he was afraid of this tour in advance. His fears were not in vain. We spent endless hours at the US Embassy in London waiting for visas. Today's tours require a huge amount of paperwork, but even then there was enough bureaucracy, and communications were slow and poorly established. In the end, we still got to Winterland, and there the first pleasant surprise of this tour awaited us. The organization on the set was very professional, and the other musicians who performed were surprisingly welcoming and enthusiastic about our music. They didn't try to compete with us, like blow everyone else off the stage, which is so common in Britain. However, although we were billed as the Light Kings of England on the poster, here our light show, in Andrew's words, was ridiculous. I felt like a fool, honestly. But some concerts, for example, in the Città Club in Venice, in Los Angeles, turned out to be more successful. In the big venues we weren't the headliners, and besides, the other bands were much more played and used their own equipment, but in this club, as the main band and with the support of our light show, we could control the general atmosphere and mood, like at the UFO Club. In part, our group was promoted on television. Years before MTV, the promotion system was for the group to appear on one of the current all-star shows. Sid was already approaching a catatonic state, and you are not mistaken if you think that this did not lead to anything good. Sid was becoming difficult, if not out of control. Having beautifully portrayed the song Under the Veneer for a dry run, he then stood indifferently during recording, and the director vainly repeated, "Okay, the recording has begun." We fulfilled our commitment to the West Coast, but cancelled all the East Coast shows and flew straight back to Europe to play in Holland. If any more proof is required that we did not want to acknowledge the gravity of Sid's condition, then there is no better way. It doesn't fit in my head. Why did we think that new concerts would help him immediately after the transatlantic flight? Back in England, Brian Morrison arranged for us to take part in the Jimi Hendrix concert tour. We had a great opportunity to watch Jimi play and really spend time with the musicians we loved. We were finally able to find common ground with other bands, most notably The Nice, who had similar musical leanings but backed up by amazing technical prowess and, in the case of their keyboardist Keith Emerson, future Emerson, Lake and Palmer member, genuine virtuosity. They took us on a special bus, where everyone was packed except for the headliners, and this bus looked like a crazy school picnic. With transportation, we generally became unpredictable. A few months earlier, we decided to buy a Bentley. For some reason, we felt that the Bentley was a practical and reliable vehicle that would help to strengthen our image. Another car dealer celebrated his triumph, and we had an exhilarating trip, because no workshop for our Bentley could find normal brakes to replace the failed ones. Roger still dreams of this car. While touring with Hendrix, we released the single Apples and Oranges, our next attempt at creating a hit. Apples and Oranges is another Sid's quirky composition and would have been a great track on an album, but probably not for a single. However, for lack of better, we, with the help of Norman Smith, tried to turn this song into a hit by adding a recording of the choir and all sorts of echoes. I don't remember us playing apples and oranges in concert very often, if at all. It seems that we were under pressure from the Americans. They needed a single to tie into an overseas tour, but then we simply did not have time to deal with our promotion in the States. In general, this single proved once again that it is better to trust your instincts and make your own decisions than to listen to other people's advice. When the tour ended, in December 1967 we played at the Olympia. The program was called Christmas on Earth Continued. Sid was knocked out again, and the group reached breaking point. The jokes were over, and for Sid, too. We didn't want to lose him. He was our songwriter, singer, and guitarist, and besides, although you can't tell from our not very sympathetic treatment of him, he was our friend. At first we decided to follow the example of the Beach Boys. This decision was prompted by stories about Brian Wilson. He obviously could not perform, so he mainly sat at home and wrote songs. We were hoping we could add another guitarist to the band to take the pressure off Sid. The name Jeff Beck would come up, which would have been an interesting, and brilliant, experiment, but none of us would have had the guts to just pick up the phone. Roger dared to do this only 25 years later. The first time we cautiously approached David Gilmour was when I spotted him in the audience in late 1967 at our concert at the Royal College of Art. Further events began to develop very quickly. In early 1968, there were a number of gigs where we tried to play with 5 of us. What Sid felt like, one can only guess. He was probably seriously confused and angry because his influence was steadily fading away. On stage, he did not strain at all and played on the machine. He probably sabotaged the work because he did not want to participate in this farce. But the more Sid pulled away, the more we saw that we were making the right decision. Everything was resolved in February, one fine day, when we were driving to a concert in Southampton. On the way to Sid, someone in the car asked, "So, shall we pick up Sid?" And the answer was, "No, he went to hell, well, him." More importantly, the public did not resent and did not demand money back. It was clear that Sid's absence was not critical. The next time we just didn't bother picking it up again. The general meeting, in the presence of Sid, was held in early March at Peter's house. Peter recalls, "We fought to keep Sid. I didn't really know David, although I heard that he is a talented guitarist and a very good performer. Sid's guitar was better for him than for Sid himself." However, Peter and Andrew ultimately relented, and after a brief burst of recrimination, the partnership was terminated. Andrew specifically emphasizes that the decision to leave was a real shock for Sid, because Sid, unlike someone else, never considered us his accompanying team. He was truly committed to the group. "Our breakup was natural," says Peter. Having finally sorted out all the details, in early April we officially announced the departure of Sid and the arrival of David. It was going to be a very difficult time for us as we hadn't been on the charts for almost a year. The singles that followed Arnold Lane and See Emily Play didn't live up to expectations at all. By all rights, you should start all over again. We returned to the old goals and musical ideas, to a well-coordinated joint game. We felt like a whole group again. Without a doubt, the most difficult task fell on David. He got the unenviable share of portraying Sid. He certainly could add his own improvisations to any live performance, but our recent recordings contain too many fragments performed by Sid, which could take at least a year to replace. Among other things, David was required to imitate Sid singing on various European TV shows. David poured new strength into the group. He was an artistic guitarist, and his vocals turned out to be strong and very distinctive. David was no less interested in experimenting with new sounds and effects, but along with inventiveness, he gave the band a more thoughtful, structured approach and spared no time and patience to develop each musical idea to its full potential. David looked good on stage. All that David lacked was a substantial inheritance to pay our debts, which by then had already reached a substantial sum of £17,000. That was one of the side effects of our Black Hill deal. We got the rights to the name Pink Floyd, and in return we had to rent or buy the van, lights, and sound system ourselves. We still played quite a few gigs, but there was a significant difference between last year's gigs and this year's. We became more and more professional, and now we even have a normal team. Our first really experienced road manager was Peter Watts. Over time, Peter Watts got an assistant, Alan Stiles, a former Army fitness instructor. Europe was not heavily represented in our 1967 schedules, but in 1968 we spent time in France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and it was a wonderful time. Dutch and Belgian venues were common then, France not so much, although it later became one of our biggest markets. Concerts further south in Europe were more difficult. One May festival at Palazzo dello Sport in Rome was a serious test of readiness to work in Italy. The performance in Leuven, Belgium was one of those rare, fortunately, times when we had to get off the stage. The concert took place at the university, where two hostile factions of young scientists, the Flemish and the Walloon, preferred to express their dislike for each other physically. The students were throwing glasses at each other, and everything seemed to be, "We will be the next target." In an indecent and cowardly haste, we finished and retreated from the stage, escaping in the transit that awaited us. Our equipment suffered only superficial damage, and we ourselves escaped with a few battle scars. Chips from a roadside cafe and a claustrophobic bunk on a ferry from Dunkirk, that was the usual taste of continental nightlife. When we weren't on the road, we worked in the studio on a new album, again adjusting the recording sessions to fit our touring schedule. The next album after Piper, called A Saucerful of Secrets, was recorded at Abbey Road and included all our achievements during that period. The title track A Saucerful of Secrets is, in my opinion, one of the most coherent and harmonious pieces we've ever produced. It did not have a standard song structure, verses, choruses, 8-bar bridge, contrasted with more improvisational pieces, and was carefully crafted. Roger and I marked it out ahead of time, following the classical musical tradition of 3 parts. For us it was not that unique, but unusual. Not knowing musical notation, we planned the whole thing on a piece of paper, inventing our own hieroglyphs. Our starting point was the sound that Roger discovered by bringing the microphone close to the edge of the cymbal and picking up all those tones that are lost under normal conditions when the cymbal is hit with full force. This gave us the first piece of work, and all 4 freely contributed, and the thing began to develop damn quickly. The final movement is a carefully crafted hymn that gave us the opportunity to use the ever larger organs of concert venues in performances. It culminated in the organ in the Royal Albert Hall, an instrument of such power that it was rumored that some of its registers were never activated because they could damage the foundation of the building or cause mass nausea in the audience. We also used the bizarre string loops of the mellotron, which was opposed by the musicians' union because they felt it was taking work away from live string players. The day a Saucerful of Secrets was released, June 29, 1968, we played the first free show in Hyde Park with Roy Harper and Jethro Tull. It turned out just fabulous, the weather was excellent, the atmosphere was pleasant and relaxed. Soon we were back in the States, 10 months after our first disastrous trip across the ocean. However, the strike of American air traffic controllers led to the fact that a relatively small tour resulted in a big drama. Since work visas were again delayed, we had to arrive in the States as tourists, then quickly hit the road to Canada. And only then to get all the necessary documents in the middle of a series of concerts at the Steve Paul's Stage Club in New York. This semi-basement club on the corner of 47th Street and 6th Avenue was a famous New York concert venue and, despite its tiny size, was the perfect launching pad for us. A free bar for musicians made up for meager fees. With New York summer night temperatures and low ceilings, the atmosphere in the club was tense. This first major tour of ours was greatly refreshed by the interactions with two other British bands that happened to be with us along the way, Soft Machine and The Who. We have always felt a great affinity with Soft Machine. True, they did not immediately achieve popularity. Their music was more esoteric and inspired by jazz. The Who embodied most of the qualities that we aspired to as a professional band. They've been headlined on billboards, performed in 5,000-seat sit-down concert halls, and demonstrated a convincingly professional attitude. Just before Christmas 1968, we made our last entry into the singles market. Point Me at the Sky was our third attempt since Emily and therefore our third failure in a row. Then it dawned on us, we decided from now on to pour contempt on the public that buys singles, and for the next 11 years we chose the fate of an exclusively album group. Our next album was the soundtrack to the film More, directed by Barbet Schroeder. We had already appeared in Peter Whitehead's 1967 documentary Today, Let's All Make Love in London, and in 1968 made the soundtrack for the Peter Sykes film The Committee starring Paul Jones, although at that time our contribution was a selection of sound effects rather than music. More, however, promised to become a more serious project. Barbet, a protégé of Jean-Luc Godard, approached us with a film that had actually been completed and edited. A major tour of Britain in the spring of 1969 ended in July with a concert at the Royal Festival Hall, an event we called More Furious Madness from the Massed Gadgets of Oxymines. Another landmark show is one of my favorites, as is Games for May. David, however, is hardly one of his favorites. Due to poor grounding, he was so shocked by the current that he flew off to the other end of the stage, and until the end of the concert he was slightly shaken. The show included a composition called Work 19, in it we knocked together a table to various percussion noises. We produced this piece of furniture on stage using planks, a saw, a hammer and nails, calculated to move on to the next number with the whistle of a kettle on a portable tile. Most of this action we later reproduced in the studio, either on the Alan Psychedelic Breakfast recording or on the Unfinished Household Objects album. In the summer we worked on a double album Ummagumma. The first two sides captured the live sound of our then repertoire, Astronomy, Careful with That Axe, Set the Controls and Saucer, recorded in June, at the Birmingham Mathers and at the Manchester Trade Institute. For later live albums we recorded up to 20 different versions. For Ummagumma the choice was limited to the two best versions, with almost no debugging or rewriting. The album was released in October 1969 and generally received quite enthusiastic reviews, although we did not like it very much. However, recording it was fun and rewarding in terms of experience. The individual tracks, in my opinion, proved that the terms are not as good as the sum. Following in 1970, the second solo album, Barrett, was released. We ended 1969 with a rather ridiculous experience working with the Italian director Michelangelo Antonioni on his film Zabriskie Point. After a successful collaboration with Barbet Schroeder, we were excited to be writing film scores again. We wanted to work outside the exhausting regime of concerts and studio recording. The trouble was that Michelangelo wanted complete control and, since he himself could not write music, controlled the selection. Accordingly, each fragment had to be finished, and not sketched out, then redone, crossed out and submitted again for consideration. In the afternoon, Roger went to the Cinecittà studio and showed the recordings to the director. Antonioni never agreed to the first version and often complained that the music was too strong and overwhelmed the visual image. Among other things, we resorted to the recording of moods. We premixed different versions and layered them so that the director could sit at the mixer and literally add a more lyrical, romantic, or desperate feel to the music by moving the slider back and forth. However, this did not help either. Antonioni eventually recruited tracks from other musicians such as Jerry Garcia and John Fahey. Despite the dramatic and explosive ending, the film failed both with critics and with the public.